Hey, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So in here we want to begin connecting to our database. Now the way a framework should be is that it shouldn't automatically require you to connect to the database once you load it for the first time. So the database thing should be something you call when you start actually adding your code, because then it gives you a bit more freedom, because certain times you may not want to use that particular database name, the database type, etc., etc. This gives you time to figure out and use your own stuff. And this is why we're going to use PDO to connect to the web to the database, because with PDO you can actually change how you connect to the database quite easily if you need to. Now this is where you can put filters and all that kind of thing, and we will look at our filter function to make sure it's also working as intended. Okay, so let's begin our connection. This is the information you're going to need to connect to your database. You need obviously the database name, database user and password, and things like that. Okay, so where can we put this info? I'm just going to copy this. You should copy that and put it in your config.php here. And this is where things will work from. So let's put our debug. Let's try and put that at the beginning here. I don't know if the order matters here, but I found that when you're managing a website, you need a lot of times to go back and forth between your local version and the online version. And so it would be a pain to have to change your database settings every time you switch to the other, because once you make changes on your local version, you need to export it to the live version, and sometimes you end up replacing the config file as well. So that could be a pain. I've done that a few times, so this is why I came up with the solution of putting an if statement to say if, so it can check the server name and know which version to use. So server, and we're going to check the server name like so. If the server name be equal to localhost, then you have a different set of configuration compared to when it isn't. So the other one would just be an else, and we paste over here like so. Okay, there we go. So one is for your local version, and the other one is for the online version. So we'll leave the settings as they are for both, because you can always change them when you want. But the root should be defined only once, and it also depends on where you are. Are you on your local machine, or are you on the online version on the live server? So when you're on your live server, you are supposed to change this to your website.com like that. That will be your root path, and maybe HTTPS as well if you're using a secure connection. In this case, we'll leave this as it is for the local, and we'll imagine this is what will be on the live version. Please don't put a slash at the end there. Okay, so that's what we expect our database name to be, and all the rest are good as they are. What else we'll need is maybe the application name. So let's do another two definitions here. So we'll need the app name. That way we can name our application, and then app description. We just shortcut that as maybe we can do description. I hope that's the correct spelling over there. Okay, so it's better to use single quotes when you're not putting variables in a string, because it's faster to process. Because if you put double quotes, PHP expects there are variables in there, and it will start checking to see if indeed there are variables, and that can take a bit of time. So put single quotes, and then it won't bother. So app description there, say This is, let's just say, the best website, and then app name here, we just call it plugin PHP app or something. I don't know. So that's up to you. This is your configuration right now, and you can add other config things in here, but this will do for now. And let's use this very data inside our model.php, but let's start with database.php, because model.php actually extends database PHP. So for those that do not know OOP, or Object Oriented Programming, we can extend the functionality of some other class within another class. So that way, the second class, instead of repeating the functionality of the first one, it just grabs some of that functionality from there. So let's create a class, shall we? And this class will be called the model class. So that's the main model class. Oh, actually, this is the database class. Sorry about that. I'm too eager to do the model, I guess. So that's a database class. This one does not extend any other class. We don't even need the constructor in here, but you can make it as you wish. You could put, I'm missing an A here, so be careful with those. Also, we need a namespace here. This one is inside the core namespace as well, and usually namespaces will correspond to folder names, but it doesn't have to be the case. It's up to you to put it that way if you want. And what else? Namespace. Yeah, we need to avoid also, when we are using PDO in there, because we are in the core namespace, we're going to have a little bit of a problem. So let me show you what I mean. If I run the, what do I want to run here? The connect function. So let's create a private function. Let's just say private function connect, like that. Now this is a private function because only functions within this class will have access to it. So that's why it is like that. But we need a, let's try make it public for now so that we can mess around with it as we wish. So what I want to do is create a connection is equal to new PDO, like this. Okay. Now remember that we have constants in here. These constants are accessible everywhere on the platform, right, on the website. So I'm just going to grab this stuff over here. Let me make a string over here. Now the string goes something like this. We say MySQL, which is the driver. We put a full colon, and then we say host name, and in this case it's localhost. And then we put a semicolon this time, and we say the database name, right? DB name. You know, sometimes I think PDO is actually accepting whatever you write here. It doesn't have to be host name. I think even if you write host, it's still going to figure it out. Same with DB name here. I think you can write any gibberish, but don't quote me on that one. I haven't really tested that. So this is going to be plugin PHP underscore DB, because that will be our DB. And then over here we will put our string in there, put a comma. I want the user, so in this case the user is root, and I want the password, which is an empty string, like that. Okay, so this is our connection. Now if for some reason we fail to connect, we should actually inform the user somehow. So maybe we put a die over here and say connection failed or something. Say connection failed. This is the basic idea of connecting to a database, but we want to replace these items with actual variables from here. And then we're going to even add a filter so that we can change those if we need to somehow without changing the entire configuration. But I have some code to copy and paste, so let me just do that. In fact, the best thing to do instead of putting an if statement here is let's use a try catch instead. So let's do this. We'll set a try, something like that. I was hoping it could it would make suggestions for me, and there it is, right? Suggestion try, because I hate having to type that whole thing. But there it is. Now a try catch is where you put some code here, something that you expect might bring an error, for example reading from a file, saving to a file, etc., etc., or waiting for another web page to load, etc., etc. You put your code in here, and then if there's any error that happens, the code will move here. Instead of stopping the execution, it will just execute whatever is in here instead. That makes a clean break. Now we're just not using any exception, we're using PDO exception. So I'm going to do PDO exception like that. Now the reason I know this is just through experience, of course. When you try one thing, it doesn't work, you try another, etc., etc. So we're going to remove our code from here. So let's remove this if statement here. This is the old way of doing things. Let's put a semicolon. Let me remove that exclamation point, and let me move this baby over here. And of course I have to put this one here. I can never remember this thing, that's why I just copied and pasted it there. It's just, yeah, these are constants, these are values like integers, right? But they're saved within the PDO class, so all you have to do is access them statically like this, ATR, error mode and stuff, error mode exception, blah blah blah. This just sets the attribute of whether it should show you an error or not if it happens. So here, I don't know whether you would like to die or you would want to echo. So this is entirely up to you. If you want to stop the execution if we can't connect to the database, which is usually the case, because if you can't connect to the database, I doubt there's much you can do on the website. So we can just say failed to connect to database with error, and then let's put an error there, and we're gonna put a dot to concatenate. The error will be inside E, and there is a function in there called get message. Now keep in mind it's a function, so we put those brackets there. So you never have to do this, repeat yourself here, so there's no really need to memorize any of this. You can just type it once and then always copy and paste from another file. This is what I do really, because this, good luck keeping that in your head. Anyway, so with that, we have this, but there's something else we need as well. We need those constants to replace what's here. Now I have these constants here, the DB name, blah blah blah, etc., etc. So the thing is, I want an option to be able to edit these guys. So I will put, okay, we'll do filtering in the next video. I think let me not complicate things too much here. Let's do vars like that. DB name is equal to DB name. So all I'm trying to do is put these variables, these constants, inside a variable, because I can then edit the variable if I need to, but I can't edit constants. So I'm just going to duplicate this a few times and get everything from here. So that's the user, and then I get the password as well, and then I will get the host and the driver. So that's the host, and duplicate. Let's get the bloody driver. Okay, there we go. Now just to be neat, I like to just tab these guys over like so. completely unnecessary, but looks cool. Okay, so there we go. We have these guys, and then so I can just replace what's in here with these guys. So for example, the driver over here, the MySQL driver, you can use Postgres driver or SQLite if you want. I'll put it in there. Now, once you put these in double quotes, you have to remove these single quotes in there, like so. And what is the host name? DB host is over here. So we replace this one with DB host. And of course, let's remove these guys. DB name, where are you? DB name, right over there. So let's copy that and put it over here. Let's remove the internals, and there we go. So that works quite well. And of course, the user. Let's grab that. Here we don't need to remove anything because that is not within some double quotes. Boom. And there we go. So this is how we connect to the database. Now, if there's an exception, things will fail. Otherwise, we return the connection, like so. Okay, very, very good. Now, this one actually will be, let's call it protect. No, actually, we don't need it to be protected. It just needs to be private. Protected means if some other class inherits this class, then it will still have access to this function. But in essence, only this class will have, the functions in here should have access to this. And what else? Private. Let's do another private item. We're going to call it query ID. And this is going to just be an empty string. Now this one is going to be, should it be static? Maybe it should be static. I'm going to explain what query ID is for. There will be times when you want to query something and then you want to do something after querying that item. Let's say maybe you're querying users and you want to add some extra user information with the results that you get. So you can do that using a query ID. That way you identify the query that you want, and then you do specific things if that ID matches that particular query. But this value should be static, so we will change it a little bit later. Now, with all of this, we're just making a connection here. What we really want is to run a query. So I'm going to say public function query. So this one is public because we will be accessing it from outside this class. Okay, so this is the query function. It expects a few params. First of all, a string for a query itself. This should not be empty. And then from there, we expect an array of data. This is optional, so we're going to put an empty array like that as an option. And then also we expect a string of data type, right? Now, data type is an option we're going to have. The default is object. So this tells you whether you want, this tells the function whether you want to access, you want to get the result as objects or as arrays, just to give you that option. But this is optional, so the only thing you really need to provide is just the query. They need to assume there are no variables in there and assume you want objects as results. All right, so then what we can do is we grab that connection by saying con is equal to this, which is this current instance, and the connect function. So there we are making a connection. So we are running this function over here. So once we run it, it's going to return a connection. And within this connection, it's very easy to run a function. So for example, we're going to create a statement because we want to use prepared statements. We don't want to get hacked in here. We want to eliminate, what is it called again? SQL injection or something. I even forgot what it is because I haven't experienced it in a long time. Okay, so statement is equal to this connection prepare. So we're preparing that connection using the provided query. So now this is a prepared statement because we are giving PHP the query before we add any variables and say this part is the query itself. And then we can give it an array of data to say this is the data you should fit in those spaces. So we provide a query that has empty spaces and then we provide the data separately. That way the computer will know which parts are the query and which part are the data. That way it can't mix both, because mixing both is what leads to SQL injection. Alright, so now that we have a statement, we can say statement execute. So we execute that statement using the data provided. If there are any variables, we put them in there at this point, and we grab that as a result. Okay, so very simple and straightforward. Now, if there was a result, then let's go ahead and grab some results from there. Here, I'm just going to put a return false. And then over here, I will grab, wait, this is the result of the execution. But if you want the actual rows, you do the statement and then say fetch all, like that. Alright. Now on fetching here, we either use PDO fetch obj, or we can use PDO fetch let's see here, we'll put an if statement, say if data type is equal to object, then we will do this. If not, we will do something else. So let me duplicate these guys. Let me move one over here. Let me move one in there, like so. Right? Great goodness. So obj, this one gets us an array, so we call it a sock. So anything that isn't object, we just assume it's an array, and then rows is going to be equal to that. Now, if is array rows and count rows is greater than 0, meaning if the result of this is an array and it actually has content, then let's return rows. Okay, that is awesome. This is all you need to run a query. Now, of course, if the query doesn't return any results, we'll return false. If it does, we return the results themselves. Very good. Now, as for the query ID, we're going to do something there. Let me actually just, I think we'll do filtering in the next video so that you understand what I'm doing before we get to this point. What I want us to be able to do is manipulate this data without actually changing the way the function works. So let's say, for example, I want after every query, I want to run some other thing within this function. I can just put those functions like the do action, right? So that we can do an action before running a query or after running a query. But usually the do action function will not be very useful in here, because I want to be able to manipulate the rows that were returned here, and so that's why I'll need a filter instead. The do action function does not manipulate the data you supply. So for example, where in this function thingy, yes, we have do action over here. There's a hook and there's data, but it does not return anything. It just runs whatever is here. But we need these two functions now, the add filter and do filter, because those will grab whatever data you supply. In this case, these will be rows from the database. It will get that data and then do something to that data before you receive it. So that all you need to do is just say, I want this data, and then you add a filter there and provide a function that you want the filter to follow. And as simple as that, you can manipulate the data just after it's read from the database. That means you don't have to touch this function or edit this function at all, but you can extend its functionality through filters. So we will show that, of course, in the next video. But let me check here to see if everything is good. The only thing we should add here is the filter. Okay, so what I'm going to do is real quick here. What I'll do is I'm going to go to functions, and there's this do filter thing here. So what I'm going to do is say the hook do filter function. I just want to add the basics here. So this one will be a string, and the hook, okay, that's required, and then data. Data could be an empty array like that. I think data should always be an array. So we'll do that. And then what we'll say is return data like that. So this returns an array, supposedly, because we're getting an array anyway. Okay, so these are the minimum requirements. What I'm doing here is I'm just making sure that the function, whatever I give it, whatever data I give it, it returns back that same data. Now this may sound stupid, but that's actually very useful, because in between here, when this data was supplied and sent back, we can actually do some stuff to this data, manipulate it somehow, and then return it back. So for now, I'm just making sure that we return the data, the same data that we have here, so that when I use it in here in advance, it will still do pretty much what I want it to do. So do filter is here. We'll give it a hook. The hook, we're going to add the add filter. No. It's the do filter that we put there. This gets confusing sometimes whether you have to use the add filter or do filter. But if you wanted to do something, we use the do filter. So in this case, let's say, for example, I am loading this query. And before the query actually runs, I want to do a filter. So I'm going to say do filter like this. This will be more obvious once we start utilizing it better. Actually, it will make more sense down here. So let's do it over here. So instead of return here, we're just going to say, let me just move this over like so. Okay, like that. Right. Okay, so once we grab our rows here, there are times when you want to add or remove information from the rows. So what we will do is, let's create an array here that will be equal to, that's an empty array, right? And then we will say result or rows. Actually, instead of rows, let's put result here like that. Okay, so I'm going to say result is equal to do filter. This is a very useful part, and in here I will create a hook. I'm going to call this one after, the same way we have the controller hook, the view hook, after view, and so on. Here we have the after query. So in the same way, if we go to, let's say, basic auth plugin, there are these hooks that we create. You can also say add action here. Instead of adding an action, you can add a filter like that, and then in here you say after query, okay, something like so. and then you provide a function that will run. So what will happen is that this function will run every time I run a query in my system. This function is going to be called. So in that situation, I have an opportunity to alter the data just after it's been queried, before the actual function that did the query even gets it. So just after the query, we alter the data. So this is extending the functionality of the query function in here. So after query here, and what we're offering is this array that we've created here with its data. And then the result of that is what we check. If it's an actual array and the result is greater than 0, then we return that. Now, yeah, actually that works out just fine. So here are the things that the function in the do filter, that because here there could be 10 functions that are doing the same filter at once, running one after the other. So there's information those functions may need to know. For example, what was the query that was given in this case? So we can easily grab that from the query variable. And then, for example, what was the data that was given? What variables were given in there? And we can get that from data as well. And also, we may need the result itself, right? Even though the result is being given here, but oh, yeah, no, we are supplying this array here, so we must put the result there. So the result will be in form of rows, like that. Now, it's possible here rows may not exist, so let's put this double question mark and put an empty array, like so. Yeah, that should solve that problem. And then finally, we may need the query ID, because the ID is important to figure out which query to do what with, which result to do what with. Now this one, I will make it a static value, like so. And that's because I want to only have one query ID at a time. I don't want to have instances with query IDs all over the place. So I'll put it as a static. I'll explain what's the difference between a static and a dynamic variable in this case. Just give me a minute here. And then I will say result, and then I'll say query ID over here is going to be equal to self, which is this class right here, and then the variable query ID, like that. And then finally, every time, once we just run the query ID once, we should remove it. So I'm going to say self query ID should be equal to an empty string, like that. Okay, so we send all that data through here to whatever function is going to need to manipulate that data. It will be handy for it to have this information as well. Okay, so with all that, we have done our filter. And you will see, like I mentioned, you will see this in action and you appreciate it, hopefully. All right, so with this, I think our query function is done, but let's just add one more query just for fun. And this query will mimic exactly this. So I'm just going to duplicate that. It's also going to be a public function, but this one is just going to be get row, like get row. So the only difference with this function and this one is that this one will return just one result. Okay, so just one result. And in this particular case, all we want to do is whatever query is supplied, we're just going to say return the result of running this query with all these params given. So we'll send that very query, we'll send that very data, and we'll send that very data type, like that. Simple and straightforward. Now instead of returning this, we're just going to say, actually, let's do result is equal to, and then grab this part down here, like so, and paste it here. So we only care really if there's an actual result, and then we just return the first item. Just like that. This is the only difference between this one and this one. Because there are certain times you don't want to fiddle with the data to get just that one record. You just want this to return an object, which is one record. Okay. This is great. This is great. Now, if it isn't here, of course, we have to return false. That's important as well. All right, so that is our database class. Now, the same way we've added a filter here, we will add more filters here as well. So I can just add those in advance, and we will use them as needed. So I'll do 2 of these here. The first one will be, this is before query. So I'm just going to say before underscore query. It says before before after. That's a good one. Before query, and I'll put query at the end, and before query data. Now you can name these hooks whatever you want, whatever makes more sense to you. So here all I want to do is, if you want to edit the query before it's actually run, we can do that. We say query is equal to filter it, and then here we will put a query. Now this data we provide is not an array, and if you look to the functions thing, we're expecting an array here, so that isn't cool at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an empty like that and say I'm expecting either a string or an array. So back here, and we can supply that. And then here we'll supply the data that came in and get another data result. So we'll say the data that we're going to use here is the filtered version to whatever function wants to filter it, and then we supply it. That way we get a chance to manipulate that data before it goes into effect if we so wish. So we may never use these filters here, but it's just good to have them there for future use so that you don't have to put them there in your future versions of things. So we'll put that here. Also, we will put another filter over here because I want us to be able to filter these variables here. Now, in case, for example, you're running your website and you want to make a very different connection compared to what items are inside the actual config file here. So you don't want to change the stuff that is in the config, but you just want to make one query to a very different database altogether. You can have the opportunity to edit this using a hook, and we can call that before maybe connection or something, before connect, before db connect, something like that. You can call it that, whatever you want. And in this case, we want to change the vars. Okay, so that way the vars that we add here could be edited in here before we actually add them, which will override the original values. This is why I mapped these to these guys, so that we can actually edit them if we wish before we send this here. Now, I don't think there's more you can edit here. Maybe you want to edit the connection, which I doubt. You can put a filter here if you want, or you can also even put the do action function here if you want to perform just an action before the connection is done. That's up to you. You can also do action here as well with the same names here if you want just to do stuff that isn't necessarily filtering data. All right, so yeah, I think we have a good database class over here, but if we try to connect, I think we will have a little bit of a problem. So let me show you in a minute. Let me go to my plugin here in the basic auth. What I'm going to do is, let me remove all of this. All I want to do is say db is equal to new database. like that. Okay, and then I will say, what will I do? I'll say db query. I'll just say select all from users. I just want to run something, some kind of query. Doesn't matter what the result will be. I just want to run something. So let's come here and try to connect. So this is the thing we get. So unquote class database not found. So please remember to always put the namespace here. We can either say use core like that, database like so, and then that error will disappear. As you can see, it says unexpected token use. Okay, that's because use should probably be right at the top there. Okay, so return value must be of type array. String returned. Where was the string returned here? Do filter. Okay, yeah, that's my bad. If we go back to the do filter, we should expect an array or a string here, like that. Okay. Actually, you know what? This is a mixed value. So let's not suffer with this. This also can be a mixed value. So let's do that. Refresh. Okay, undefined variable key SDB name on line 23. So let's go and find that in database 23. I made a mistake somewhere here. That S should not exist. Okay, and then finally we say class core PDO not found. So the reason we're getting this is, you see this function here, it's not found, this class is not found because we are inside the core namespace, and it's expecting to find that in the core namespace, which is it isn't. This is not inside any namespace. Now we can solve this problem by just looking for wherever there is PDO and put a slash at the beginning like this, which would tell it that PDO is not in any namespace, it's just in the PHP normal namespace. And then it says also PDO exception, unknown database. Yeah, so things are working now, but instead of doing this, I would rather we go here and say use dash PDO like that. Okay, so that way it tells me that it knows that whenever I say PDO, I'm referencing the one that's not in this namespace. Also, it will be better to use PDO exception like that, because also that's a different class. When we are doing this, you might get that error as well. So that solves that. But let's look what it's saying. It's saying the database is unknown. So it says failed to connect to database with error unknown database plugin PHPDB. So this is a very simple error because we just need to create a database, right? So let's create that. If we want, actually, let's not do that. I just wanted to see if it's going to work, and so far it is working, even though it's giving me that error that we don't have that database. But everything here has been sorted and everything is fine. All right, guys. So let me go back and remove this from here. Like that, so we don't get those errors anymore. And there we go. All right, guys. So I'll see you in the next video where we create our model class, the main model class here. And then we can begin with the fun stuff of creating actual plugins.